Good afternoon, everyone. I first would like to thank the organizers to have this great Symmetry Festival with so many great participants. I also thank them for allowing me to produce or to, let's say, okay. Thanks to the organizers for organizing this great Leaning Symmetry Festival and for the opportunity to present my work, which deals with universal natural shapes, both in, let's say, the large and the small and with everything's intermediate. My background is botany, so many of the things you will see are from biology. So the world for me, and both the scientific world and the natural world, is all is in Wonderland. The book is basically all is in Wonderland, and awe and wonder are the basis of all science. Now we all know the very famous dictum from by Eugene Wigner, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences, and that's very well known in physics. But I would like to juxtapose this with a saying from the mathematician Gelfand, who ran a biology seminar in Moscow for more than 20 years. Says there exists yet another phenomenon comparable in its inconceivability with the inconceivable effectiveness of mathematics in physics, and that is the equally inconceivable ineffectiveness of mathematics in biology. So we have mountains of data that we process, but do we know anything at all about biology? And if we take a more geometrical view, then I could quote Marcel Berger, famous geometer. Present models of geometry, even if quite numerous, are not able to answer various essential questions. For example, among all configurations of a living organism, describes its trajectory or its life in time. So basically, understanding life is one of the major challenges for science in the 21st century. Now, this is a conference about symmetry, and I always think back of the definition of symmetry by the geometry professor Leopold Verstralen. And this is basically in line with the definition that Dr. Darvas always used. It's a preservation of some measure of some aspects or facets of some objects and the application of some kinds of transformations. And then depending on what kind of aspects or facets or which kinds of objects, or what you measure before and after these transformations, there may be many, many different kinds of symmetries in agreement with this definition. And maybe look back at asymmetry, that's asymmetrical in our view, but maybe symmetrical in the view of a starfish, for example. As noted by my colleague Daniela yesterday, symmetry has its root in Greek. The ancient Greek mathematicians, to symmetrize was the deliberate act of measuring by comparison so that you could find a common ruler to measure shapes and natural objects. And that's also in the end of the 19th century, Henri Poincaré says mathematics is giving the same name to different things. So my talk will be basically non-mathematical, but asking questions and to the audience. It's going to be a recipe with 3 ingredients: evidence-based science, that's how it starts, and then only the rules of arithmetic, Pascal's triangle, and the conic sections, which were the basis of the scientific revolution, and which are the 4 well-known circle, ellipse, parabola, and hyperbola. And I would like to add 3 flavors. Awe and wonder. We have to be wonder about what we see every single day. We have to be cautious and careful and very keen on observation. What do we see when we're observing? And then asking simplest of questions with or without answers. My work focuses on one continuous transformation between all these shapes. And many of these shapes will be observed in nature, and it's one continuous transformation over the real numbers. So if you can easily go from a square to a pentagon without any hassle. But first, we asked simple question. What do we see when we are looking? On the left, we have Marsilea leaves. It's a water fern. And on the right, we have the sepals of hydrangea. Hydrangea has colorful sepals, and the small, really fertile flowers are the small ones in the things. But the sepals aim to attract pollinators. And I asked to several people in the beginning, what are these shapes? And mathematicians and scientists and laymen and so on, and artists, they said it's round. These shapes are round, but what do you mean by round? And then actually, I'll tell you in a minute, but my work started in bamboo. Bamboo are tall grasses up to 30 meters tall of woody stems. And all bamboos have cylindrical stems for some reason. But there are exceptions. Himano bamboos is a genus of square bamboos that have, let's say, a more squarish shape. If you remember the Marsilea fern, that's the leaves, the four leaflets are basically arranged in that shape that you see here. And why are these called super circles? Because they were discovered by Gabriel Lamé in the 1815, 1818. So he, going from Pythagoras to the supercircle and ellipse, is just adding a number n, an exponent n, where Pythagoras deals with squares. The a and b makes a superellipse. And it's phenomenal what you can achieve with this, because any shapes on the left, you'll see, are just a red, yellow, green, blue, reddish, are just one number n. So for example, if number n is 1, we have the inscribed square. If n is 2, we have the circle. If n goes very large, we have the circumscribed square. And that's a shape that you also see in one of Escher's circle limits. Now, it started with bamboo, and then 25 years later, we tested it in bamboo, and we confirmed the original hypothesis. So with 30 columns of square bamboo cut in different pieces, 750 pieces, we got something like more than 1,400 shapes. And both the inner and the outer shapes were perfectly fit with just a superellipse, just two numbers, this a and b, or the ratio of it, and this exponent n. And why is that important? Because the same study has been done for tree rings. And on the lower right, you see tree rings of white spruce. And the graph depicts the exponent, the value of the exponent, and the value of k. And k is then the ratio between a and b, so an ellipse. And there are two numbers that play a role. So actually, the a and b, the upper left graph, so the ratio of minor to major semi-axis, and then the power, the exponent 10. But immediately you can see that the exponent is hardly 2. So the exponent is always larger than 2. And if we forget about the lower left, the n, and we take n is 2, then this ratio between small and larger semi-axis of the ellipse is basically what Kepler did. So he moved the circle into an ellipse, and that fitted very well to the, let's say, to the orbits of planets, and that started the scientific revolution half a century later with Newton. And we see the same. So just take the work that Kepler did, add just one number, just make the exponent n instead of 2, and we can do all these tree rings as well. So one step beyond Kepler. So when I published my original paper in the American Journal of Botany, at the American Mathematical Society website, mathematicians wrote a botanical Kepler awaiting his Newton. So one unifying description and only one step beyond Galilei. But we had these squares, and then the next question was, is there a way to capture the geometric essence of natural shapes? We see squares are a bit rare in nature, but we see all this kind of spirals, we see triangles, we see diatoms, we see on the lower right, we see projected DNA and viruses. We see a galaxy with tropical storms. and so on and so forth. So we see leaves of an enormous variety. And that's my contribution to science, published as an invited special paper. A generic geometric transformation, continuous transformation, as I will show, that unifies a wide range of natural and abstract shapes. I called it super formula because of the generalization of supercircles and superellipse, and it could do so much more. This is from the cover of my first book. So if you look at square stems, if you look at starfish, if you look at flowers, if you look at mollusks, if you look at avian eggs in the center, if you look at Victoria leaves, round leaves, if you look at square stems, triangular diatoms, and so on and so forth. And then coming into contact with this unifying description, then geometers understood that they called it Gielis transformation in the first place. They describe, that was my goal, and determine in a uniform and universal way an enormous diversity of natural shapes. Determine has to do with the how and the why. This, what I will tell you is mostly the description. So, and again, just a very short overview. So if you transform Gabriel Lamé's supercircle into polar coordinates, and then the step I took, if you add m divided by 4, that does the trick that Lamé did for squares, now also for pentagons and triangles. And if you apply it to some planar function phi theta, lower right, then you have transformations. And here's what they do. For example, the super formula itself on the left panel, choosing m is 5 gives you all the square fish, the pentagons and the starfish. M is 7, M is 8, you can do whatever you want for number. And natural shapes show up in the right panel, for example, cross-sections of plant stems, starfish. And as a transformation onto functions, you can modify a spiral into a square spiral or to a mollusk shape, or you can modify flowers into real flowers. And flowers and waves are just mathematically the same. M does not have to be integer. So if you take m is p over q and q is 1, then you have the pentagons and the triangles and the 2 angles and the 1 angle in the upper left. But you can also take m divided is 5 divided by 2. If you take 5 divided by 1, you have 5 angles in one rotation, and then it closes, and that's a pentagon. But if you take 5 over 2, then you have 5 angles in 2 rotations. You have to go around 4 pi or 720 degrees, and it gives you the symmetry of a pentagram, and so on and so forth. So all these shapes that you see here are just a choice of 2 or 3 different numbers. Now, going to 3D does not really complexify the whole thing or make things more complex, because if you think about a sphere, you can think about it if you cut it in the center and then a perpendicular, you have 2 circles. Now, if you would take a square and you put them together in the same way, the one is rho 1 theta and the other is rho 2 phi, then you have a cube. If you take a triangle and a square, you have a pyramid. If you take a triangle and a circle, you have a cone. And of course, they don't have to be the same shape, same size. For example, you can have a bigger circle and a square going around it, which gives you a circular square torus or a completely square torus. And even if you change a few more numbers, you can get the most complex shapes that you can imagine, or not imagine even. So you have like spherical and toroidal, and many more shapes. Again, in the very beginning, we did many experiments, and all these shapes came out. It's just a generalization of the sphere, but the sphere has the same complexity. But what interested me most, of course, was the use in biology. So we have a lot of, especially in botany and also in biology in general, many qualitative terms. A leaf is elliptical, a leaf is lanceolate if it's longer than wide, and so on. But now we could do with this a single parameter. If you think about it, the radius defines all circle. 2 parameters defines all the ellipses. What can we do with 2 or 3 parameters, like in the case of the tree rings? And we tested that for more than 40,000 natural shapes tested, and they turned out to be all superformula. We tested them on flowers, we tested them on seeds, and tested them on avian eggs. This is one example. So these names of the leaves of bamboo, lanceolate, almost elliptical. Now they get one quantitative description, just two numbers, the size and the shape. And with these two numbers, and let's say we test 100 leaves of one plant, we can, in principle, if we would build a database, discern every single species on Earth. And that led to many, many publications. One of the most notable is that a general leaf area geometric formula exists for plants. And we call this the simplified Gielis equation. And why? Because it's only using 2 or 3 of the 5 to 7 parameters that are in the original formula. Tested it on starfish, we tested it on diatoms, we tested it on fruits, triangular fruits. We tested it in so much more. In diatoms, for example, a unified geometrical description of a wide variety, again, of diatoms. All the avian eggs in the world can be done like this. So this article of ours was a response to an article that claimed to have a very universal complex model for all the avian eggs. But if you look at the panels on the left, says nourishing Romanov-Griffin equation, says 2 times, and you compare it with Gielis equation, and you compare the root mean square errors, you see how much better the fits are with our 2 numbers. So, and that's why this is a case of professors in mathematics education. They tend to call it a magic formula of nature. But what I want to do now is actually nature explores, and how do we perceive nature, and what questions do we ask. One important thing about exploration of nature is that they tend to try everything. Huh? And we generally think in terms of archetypes. If we think of a starfish, the image of a starfish is something special. If we think of shells, and the link between mathematics and biology, we tend to think of the nautilus shells. Now, if you look at starfish, the upper row are cookie starfish, very small ones, a few centimeters, occur in Philippines, and they are very different from the classical starfish on the lower row. They're almost pentagons. So nature is really not about archetypes, but about form diversity. If we look at another genus, Culcita novae Guinea, also in the Philippines, cushion starfish are almost spherical. So my reasoning was, if, let's say, soap films and soap bubbles are spherical, and you have the archetypical starfish, nature should have experimented with something in between. And yes, it has. So this is an example, again, against stereotypes, archetypes. Now I'm going to ask you for a few questions. So when we compare the radial symmetry of a starfish and a circle, which of the following statements is true? So the circle has a higher symmetry of a starfish. That's the Archimedean idea of a polygon with infinitely many sides, approximating a circle. The circle has a lower symmetry of a starfish. The circle has the same symmetry of the starfish. And all the above statements are correct. Now if you look at a formula and we fill in m is 0, let's say the first statement is the Archimedean one, that's correct. Second one, if we fill in m is 0, then we have a 0 gone. It's a circle, lower symmetry than a starfish. Can it have the same symmetry? Yes. If we fill in m is 5, we can have a starfish for certain values of n2 and n3, but if n2 and n3 are 2, then we have a circle again. So again, this is correct. And all of the above statements are correct is also correct. So we have the 4 statements correct. And that's very important, because if a starfish, let's say purely hypothetical, if we don't take into account the larval stage, if you have an egg of a starfish, which is spherical, and it grows into a starfish, pentagonal, then this pentagonal symmetry can already be hidden inside this circle in the sphere. And it is hidden like that. Another example is, let's say, if we think of a circle, or we start from an ellipse and we morph it into a rectangle, then we have long, short sides. And the same thing happens in snowflakes. We can have snowflakes with hexagonal plate shapes or with short, long sides. You can have that in halide, silver halide crystals as well, pure hexagons and almost triangles rounded. And they can both be by a choice of parameters by this A and B. We can go from a hexagon to a hexagon with short and long sides. And we don't need any symmetry breaking. So the symmetry of ice is 6 and it remains 6, even if it's falsely said a truncated triangle. It's not. It's really a hexagon with short and long sides. So again, thinking outside of the box gives us new ways of thinking about shapes. Mollusk, for example, or shells. This is a typical classical morphospace. This is from Stephen Wolfram. You can add a few parameters and then you can get all of them. But actually, if you look at the diversity of shapes and we look at the log spiral of Nautilus, it's certainly not a rule. This continuous growth happens to being snails, but not in mollusks and not in worm shells. And so they have a very diverse things. So you can definitely a log spiral is not a rule. You can have many, if you take, let's say, the log spiral with transformations described by the super formula, you can get many of these shapes indeed in 2D and 3D. So you have to adapt this morphospace with just one transformation. Now, in nature has experimented also in other ways. In ammonowitz, for example, you have triangular coiling. The one is the fossil on the left, and some pictures and drawings, mainly pictures on the right from the original description of Saliclimenia. And these are found in Berlin, in the Museum for Natuurkunde. And not only that, so in Voclumeria and Paravoclumeria, you have kind of very strange shape with kind of constriction zones, as you see on the right. But as you see on the left, these were experiments by a graphical artist, and he came up with 16 shapes that he liked and made shells out of it. And you see that some of these shells, particularly the one in the third row, second from the left, is very, very similar to the shape. So what we found in mathematical space and what we found in back in the historical record or the paleontological record is exploration. Nature has explored and we can explore. So now beyond archetypes, also for plants, flowers, and leaves. So we have first, if we think about plants, plants is a repetitive, let's say, structure. So you have a piece of culm or stem with a bud and a leaf. That's it, and you repeat this over and over. And let's say on a stem with vegetative leaves, the internodes are long, but if you press the internodes together, you get, let's say, the sepals and the petals and the stamens and the pistils. They're all modified flowers, and it was first seen by Goethe, expressed in Alles is Blood. Now, with the super formula, we can have a large diversity of shapes, just encoded into just the same few numbers as you see on the right, upper right. Now, in leaves, we have a huge diversity. How can we deal with that? But first, I have to say that beyond archetypes, if we think about mathematics and symmetry, we can say, well, there's a lot of spirals in plants, but spirals are basically in the more primitive plants. And say once you go to seed plants and you go to angiosperms, this spiral structure is much less. For example, if you go to the angiosperms, there's a great regularity in that the monocots, such as the tulips and the lilies, they have typically a symmetry of 3, all the orchids. And you may count 6 of these same petal-like structures, but there are 3 plus 3, 3 sepals and 3 petals. The structure, if you go to dicots, you have 2 main say, divisions, the rosids and the asterids. And in the rosids, you hardly see any petals growing together. And in the asterids, you have petals growing together. And depending on when in the development the petals start growing together, early or late, you can have the lamnids and the campanulids. So there's a great regularity in this evolutionary structure of, let's say, plants. And many of the plants that we study, the higher plants, if we call them, angiosperms, are really about whorlflowers, much less about spirals. Now, fusion in general, let's say here we saw a fusion of a growing together of leaves, but actually the whole of seed plants is growing together of things growing into a seed and adding a fruit to it. The gymnosperms have no fruits, only the naked seeds. The angiosperms do have seeds inside a fruit. Now, fusion also occurs if you look at, for example, petals. And if we can fuse them with their, let's say, we have on the one hand a shape, the blue one on the upper left, and the constraining shape in which it has to grow, then the resulting shape would be a red one, which conforms to the upper left flowers. And if you have more fusion, that conforms to Caralluma freria. And so you see in this fantastic group of flowers, you say how fusion also plays a role and how we can model this with shapes. The same in cacti, the same in astrophytum as an example. So this is a circle in one direction and a 5/2 polygon in another direction. Life is generally dealing with stress. Development of plants is dealing with stress, internal stress and external stress, what the environment imposes upon you, and let's say the turgor pressure inside the plant is. And one example is, for example, when a flower is developing. These are the upper panel, shows developing flowers, like all these things are constrained into a very compacted structure, either squarish or pentagonal. Now, on the lower left panel, if we compute the curvatures on the black shapes, then they happen to be the blue ones. And that's remarkable. You compress something, and the result seems to be, hypothesis, the sepals and the petals that form the complete flower. If we do the same for sand dollars, for example, and echinoderms with their floral pattern, you can see that the shape of the curvature, the blue one, is actually functionalized into the calcareous test of the sand dollar. The tube feet extend through these shapes, and they collect food and through these structures. So there's getting rid of stress or functionalizing stress in the structures that are built or the structures that are retained through evolution. Another beautiful example is we know all from mathematics that it's impossible to have a square net fit over a, let's say, a curved surface. You have to always, you have folds and things. But nature solves this in another way. So for example, in collagen fibers in the epidermis of worms, they have triangular and pentagonal solutions. The same in bombinator and frogs, so the noise-making thing. So you can, these creatures, they do fit a square net. And if you look at the lower panel, the square in the middle, n is 1, m is 4. But if you keep the exponent 1 and you go lower or higher, the area is conserved. So maybe there's a link to it. There's also the moment, polar moment of inertia, and 1 is conserved. But this conservation of area or energy in some form leads these. There's no real, let's put it, effort to be put in by these things that just form a pentagon or a triangle, just like that, conservation of something. And this is a fantastic example that was discovered by Petar Mladinic in Croatia. So if you take an inversion over a circle, the green circle, and you invert the figure in the center, inversion means that you draw from the red center through a point of the small figure, and the inversion gives you the point that from the 0 to the point on the small figure times the distance from 0 to the blue big figure, then this area, which is a rectangle, is the same as r squared, the r of the circle. So if you do that for every single petals, you find that actually the petals of this flower are something like an inversion. An inversion is always related to conservation of area, like so many things in nature, starting with a parabola. If we think about flowers, and let's think about geometry, we always think about congruence. How congruent are shapes? And how do we deal? No? So let's put it this way. In the super formula works well with bamboo leaves on the left, but much less good in the upper panel, and certainly not good in the lower right panel. Vasconcelea is a family of papaya. But if we focus not on the shape, but if we focus on area, and area is key to the photosynthetic area, then we find that the fitted red curve, let's say the simplified Gielis equation, and the area of the leaf itself is exactly the same. So what is in excess or what is in defect, they nullify each other. Huh? So if we focus not on congruence of shape, if we focus on the function, the area, then we have a very different story. So we can have snowflakes and soap bubbles. We already saw that with starfish. But in snowflakes and soap bubbles, the snowflakes, for example, in snowflakes you have spheres or catenowits as optimal shapes. But in snowflakes you have columns, you have cap columns, you have prisms, you have all these kind of things that are not the archetypical dendritic stuff, snowflake. All symmetry 6. And you see that it's depending on the temperature, depending on the humidity, that you can have columns, you can have plates, you can have capped columns, and so on and so forth. Yeah? And it is claimed in general by physicists that there are no equilibrium shapes for non-equilibrium conditions. For example, an equilibrium shape is a sphere in snow films, but this was shown to be incorrect by Miyoki Koizo and Bennett Palmer. So when they if you have your energy distributed equally, then you might end up with spheres. But if your energy functional is distributed, say, along a hexagonal prism, then your catenowit is really the one on the right, and that conforms to shapes in the snowflakes. There are equilibrium shapes for non-equilibrium, again, thinking outside the box. And then again, so apart from the fact that they conform to some conditions, anisotropic energy functional in the case of snowflakes, if we go back to tree rings, what is a tree ring? How does nature optimize? We saw that the only thing that does is play a little bit with minor and major axes and the exponent k, but we also saw that the exponent is somewhere between 1.9 and 2.1 and varies from year to year. But what is a tree ring? It builds upon what was already there, and it incorporates all the influences of the current year, which can be of biotic nature or of abiotic nature, and it has to be preparing for the next year. So trees convert the multi-objective optimization problem into n-dimensional volumes, conservation law in 2 dimensions, super ellipses, and the n is very low. Somewhere it's like n is 1.9, it's fractional, you can call it fractional, but it's really in the range of real numbers and not so far away from 2, but hardly ever 2. So if we think about multi-dimensional optimization problems, we think about 20 dimensions. No, nature does it in a simple way. And we find that optimal shapes in nature are rarely classical spheres. They're mostly like not like the soap bubbles, but they have their own way of optimizing. They're all optimal from whether you look at fluid mechanics on the upper panel, flowers, diatoms, they're all some kind of optimal forms. And why do we call them universal natural shapes now? Because when I met Professor Verstraal, a geometer, he said, well, actually, this is basically, you can also model galaxies and spacetimes with it, DNA molecules and anything you want. So according with natural curvature conditions, and what we bring to the table is a simple unifying description. So the super eggs of P-Tine were the super ellipses in the 1960s, to the cosmic egg of George Lemaitre, so the Big Bang models of Robertson Walker and Friedman Lemaitre, they are of a very similar nature in the terms of equations. So we have a unifying symmetry, unifying geometrical uniform description, and now we have to see how it couples to natural curvature conditions. There can be minimal surfaces, like in the case of equilibrium surfaces and snowflakes, the curvatures of spacetimes, or let's say how membranes form, and so on. So what we have, and it was the big dream of Gabriel Lamé, so shape-specific coordinates for all creatures great and small, for living and non-living. So we have snowflakes on the right, and we have square bacteria on the left. And we have yesterday and tomorrow. So yesterday, the triangular monoids, and tomorrow we can imagine living into a spherical conic Minkowski space. Now, going back and take a step back, what have we achieved? So if you want to propose a scientific model, according to Thomas Kuhn, there are 5 principles. First, it has to be accurate, it has to be consistent, it has to have a broad scope, has to be simple, and it has to be fruitful. So, and I think we check all the boxes. So it's in agreement with observations. It is internal and external with other accepted theories. So if you think everything with circle and optimization with circles falls into this category as a special case, far beyond the particular observations of flowers, it brings order into nature, and should lead to new research findings or unveil previously unnoted relationships, which also checks the box. So we kind of have to think about a new language for the natural sciences. So if you think about physics, everything's circle and straight lines. And the derivatives first and second derivatives. But we test and we don't find the circles there. So scientific results demonstrate unequivocally that in biology there are very few, if any, circles or ellipses. And they're not even almost circles, they're clearly super circles. The circles and spirals are pretty much exceptions, not the rules. So we may develop a new language based on our transformation, forming a bridge between the old and the new. Now I want to end with a few notes on geometry, because in the beginning I thought we only need Pascal's triangle and conic sections, and that is what I will show. First, we have to understand, if we look at the equation, it's 1 divided by some nth root of cosine and sines. But if we think back about the x to the n plus y to the n, then we conform to what Vladimir Arnold and Olga Oleinik called topologically simple. What is essential is not the degree of the equation, it can be a degree 365, but rather the number of monomials with non-zero coefficients. We have the x to some power and the y to some power, that's all. Apart from that, it's also Pythagorean compact. So we have a very compact structure, the equation. And if we fill in a few numbers like squares and for n2 and n3, we have the circle, which is Pythagoras. Now, if we think about the rules of arithmetic, this is very well known, leading to the binomial theorem, and exemplified by a board game like this. So what happens in, let's say, if you toss a coin 50 times, it's most likely that ends up about 25 times heads and about 25 times tails. That's what you would have in the middle. So it leads to Gaussian distributions and similar. So this is basically how science developed what is the most probable. And then typically, what is improbable is having 50 heads or 50 tails in a row. That's theoretically possible, but almost practically impossible. It never occurs. So you can typically forget about the outsides. If you toss a coin 1,000 times, 1,000 times heads or 1,000 times tails, extremely, extremely unlikely. And all this can be, the tails of this distribution can be neglected, and we focus on the center of distribution. Now, that's only one way to look at it. Now, let's look at the other way to look at it. If we look at the outsides, a to the fifth and b to the fifth, that's what we have now. We only use the pure numbers on the both sides, a to the fifth and b to the fifth, and we forget all the rest in between. We do completely different. So, and then it really is very simple. So if we have variable x raised to the power n, variable y raised to the power n, if we sum them up, we have supercircles and ellipses. We have natural shapes, Minkowski distance, conservation of n volumes. We did one step further, we have all the starfish and all that. And if n is 1, we have, it's directly related to the arithmetic mean. But if we take a ratio between x to the nth and y to the nth, let's say some other number, then we have all the super parabolas depicted on the right. All the power laws and all, if not most, if not all of the laws in physics are of this nature. Modulo some constant, but you have one variable to some power and the other variable to another power, and they are super parabolas. In logarithmic scale, you would have straight lines, but if n is 2, you have a normal parabola, the lower one. If n is 1, you have the bisectrix. If n is 1/2, you have the upper parabola. If n is 1/3, you have Niels parabola, these kind of things, but it's very unifying and very simple looking at from an arithmetical point of view. What is very important to understand also is that we look, if we compare, let's say, the diagonal of a square with let's say the point from 0 to the outside of the square at the horizontal line, we go from 1 to square root of 2. But that's with a Euclidean view, that's with God's eye view. But if we look at the internal geometry, things are very different. So, for example, if on the left I stretch a chord and I draw a circle, then I can say, well, I can ask to one observer on the line, which is exactly one subdivision long, how many subdivisions do you count, growing from 0 to the outside? And for every angle, he will call, yeah, I'm at 10. So which means that this is a circle. But what happens in a square? If we use not, how do we draw a square or starfish using a piece of cord, keeping it stretched like we do for the circle? How can we draw a starfish or square? Actually, it's very simple. You take an elastic and then you can really draw your starfish. And the super formula tells you how to stretch your string or your elastic. And if you look then on the inner geometry of it, you will see and you will find that if you ask the observer for every angle to count how many subdivisions he counts, he will also say 10. For 45 degrees, for 0 degrees, for 90 degrees, 72 degrees, always 10 subdivisions. But it's a unit circle, so it's 10 subdivisions or 6 million or 50 billion subdivisions away from the center, but it's a unit circle. And what's more remarkable, if you look from the intrinsic geometry, instead of going from 1 to 45 degrees square root of 2, nothing happens to the internal observer because he was defined to be one subdivision wide. So he stretches along, or he or she stretches along with a stretchable radius. So nothing happens. For him or her, it's a circle, and the internal symmetry is really circular, and there's nothing asymmetrical. The asymmetry arises from the way we view. So then there's the question, we can pose many questions. What will the future bring? Of course, we don't know. But one thing we do know is that it opens the door for a generalization of the idea of manifolds. So the idea of differentiability changes. If you have a unit circle that can be fit in another unit circle, oscillating circles, you can do the same with starfish. The starfish is the oscillating shape for the starfish. You can build fractals, you can build in an algorithmic way so many things using super formula. And that's the generalization of the notion of manifolds. Of course, what we're doing here is go beyond quadratic restrictions, and that's, say, more Finsler geometry that was initiated, let's say, by Lamé, definitely, and also by Riemann in his Habilitation-Schrift. That's why it calls Riemann-Finsler geometry, because Finsler on the right did his thesis in 1918 with Cara Theodori, who was with Minkowski and Hilbert, all at Göttingen University. So Riemannian geometry without the quadratic restriction, famous geometry called it, is Finsler geometry. So that's the way we're going in the 21st century. I myself are very interested in complex systems. Studying the heart is a very complex system, but very simple. So the heart itself, according to the cardiologist of Spain, Torrent Guaspi in the 1960s, 70s, if he unraveled the whole heart, and you should look up helical heart on YouTube, you can find a fantastic explanation there. You end up with a half angle. M is 1/2. And again, whether we talk about DNA in knots and we talk about the fossils, paleontology, we talk about DNA, or we talk about the shape of plasmas, or we talk about fiber bonds in geometry, it really can be done in a kind of unifying way. And again, one question that came to mind was, if we have 40,000 specimens conforming to simplified Gielis equation, what about phenomena? And with phenomena, I think, for example, wave phenomena or sounds. Sounds would be there. And there have been sound synthesizers using a super formula dispersion where you can modify the N2 and N3 and so on and so forth. But in a later presentation, Dominic Chapman will, let's say, tell all the experiments we have been doing. So every of this shape, let's say a starfish or a super ellipse, they all have their own cosines and sines. They all have their own dedicated Pythagorean theorem. And if we look at the cosines and sines for these shapes, they generate sounds that are perfectly not circular, not in the classical harmonics. But we hope, we think, we conjecture that many of natural sounds may also have a superformula fingerprint. So, and again, this the true pleasure is not doing all this stuff alone. The true pleasure is collaborations and cooperations all over the world. From early days, Bert Berings, Johan Fougerolles, Diego Caratelli, Antenna Company, mathematicians Paolo Ricci and Ilya Tafkalidze, the whole team in Nanjing Forestry University, so and many, many more. Dominic Chapman, Simone Brasili, Alessandro Rogato and the Tomassi Eduardo on diatoms and so on and so forth. So what the future will bring, we don't know yet, but actually, for some reason, artists also consider, artists and geometers already are consider the superformula and superellipse as part of the history of geometry. So I thank you for your attention and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.